Okay, welcome back everyone. My name is Sana Murrani. I'm Associate Professor in Spatial Practice at the University of Plymouth, but I'm also part of the team today chairing this session. The second panel, is on cartographic encounter with indigeneity. And the panelists here, we've got Michael Bravo from Cambridge and
Rohihi from Brunel University. And I'm just going to give them a very quick introduction each. So Michael Bravo is a professor of history and geography of science at the University of Cambridge. He's an honorary senior research scientist at the Stefansson Institute in Iceland, but also, and more importantly, he will be talking about the project today, is the Inuit Northwest Passage project that he will be speaking about with us. And Rohihi Rai is the lecturer in sociology of race at the Department of Social and Political Science in Brunel. Her work is on global South urbanism and post-colonial and decolonial theories from the Himalaya and Northeast Indian context. And I'd like to invite Rohihi first to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Hi everyone, I'm Rohihi, and basically today my presentation is titled Remembering Purkhavli Tau, Maps Through the Lens of Diasporic Indigeneity. So basically in today's presentation I will be talking about encounters with colonial map in the context of Eastern Himalaya and specifically in the context of Nepal and Darjeeling and Sikkim in Northeast India. And I will be doing that through the lens of diasporic indigenous communities based in the UK. And as you will see, my presentation is twofold, where at first I will be discussing the encounters with the communities through participatory methods, and the second one will be my own reflections as a diasporic indigenous scholar myself. Overall, the presentation explores how diasporic indigenous encounters reimagine the region through the lens of ancestrality, which is reflected in the notion of Purkhavli Tau, which is written in Nepali up there, which basically translates to ancestral place. So a quick background for today's presentation. This talk stems from my last British Academy funded project titled Indigenizing the Himalaya, Reimagining its Past, Present and Future, which was developed in partnership with the Royal Geographical Society with the Institute of British Geographers. Now this project was a collaborative community engagement project, and it also collaborated with 3 UK-based Himalayan indigenous diaspora organizations, namely the Kirat Yakthung Chumlung based in Ashford, UK, the Kiratra Yayokha based in Ashford, UK also, and the World Newa Organization UK chapter based in London. Now, this project focused on 3 key elements, which include dances, archives, and storytelling. So I'll try to draw from these different elements today. As a part of this project, in May 2024, we hosted what we called a storytelling through dancing workshop at the RGS, which also featured an archival recaptioning and remapping session with community members alongside dancing and storytelling. So the first part, at least, of this presentation draws from that event in particular. This event was aimed to create a space where community members could collectively encounter archival maps and photographs, particularly of Eastern Himalayan region, and respond to them through memory, embodiment, and dialogue. Secondly, today's talk also draws from the Map Room Conversations session, which was held here at the RGS in August 2024 during the RGS annual conference, where I discussed some of these maps in relation to my own positionality as a diasporic indigenous scholar. So both events highlighted how archives, particularly archival maps, become an active site where ancestral memories, performance, and affect intersect. So a quick background of the maps itself. So many of the maps that we worked with, including Sherwill's Hill Territory of British Sikkim from 1860s and Colonel Tanner's sketch map of Sikkim, Nepal, Bhutan, Tibet, Darjeeling from 1886 were products of imperial geography, and I think this bit ties to the previous session as well. They were created mainly through military and mountaineering expedition in the Himalayas, so these maps serving as visual tools to control, administer and demarcate the Himalayan region as a buffer zone, which is to say a strategic frontier of the British Indian Empire. As we discuss in a forthcoming paper based on this project, these maps were not neutral, of course, but rather they served as tools of representation with the power to delineate, classify and erase. For instance, these maps reveal how colonial bordering practices fragmented what was once a geographically and culturally continuous landscape by imposing new lines of control through notions of frontier, protectorates and buffer zones. Colonial cartography disrupted indigenous specialities, rendering local cosmologies and geographies invisible within this imperial imagination of the Himalayan region. However, when we re-encountered these maps through in the context of diasporic indigenous participants here, there was a shift in meaning and therefore representation. They became, or the maps became, what Awan calls mediators. That is, they translate rather than merely represent, whereby the maps bring people together, evoke memories and catalyze conversations to disrupt these colonial imaginations. So the first bit of my talk today, which is really the community's encounters with the maps and archival images housed at the RGS archives. So that stemmed from our archival workshop in May last year, as I mentioned earlier, where community members who are mainly from the Kirat-Rai community, which is the community I myself belong to, as well as Limbu, Newar and Gurung communities, engaged directly with the RGS collections. And through these encounters, there were two key themes that emerged. The first theme was that of ancestrality and the second of remembering. Now, talking about the first theme, that is ancestrality, the archival photos in particular once captioned the Himalayan indigenous communities through racialized lens as natives or tribals, especially if you look at the archives. The key racialized category that is consistently used is that of the Gurkha type, which links to military Orientalism and sort of recruiting mountain tribes as a part of the British Army since the time of British Indian Empire and even today. However, during the workshop, they were recaptioned, these photographs, and reinterpreted through the lens of ancestrality, moving away from the colonial category of natives to the indigenous notion of ancestors, where people in the archival image were seen as being directly related to them, the communities, as their purkha, meaning ancestors. For instance, one of the community elders who, and you can see the sort of recaptioning, remapping that we did in the images. So the first two post-its are a part of the remapping sort of activity. So one of these comments made by one of the community elders stated, and I'm quoting here, "Since arriving in the UK in 1991, it's only after 34 years of living here that I've been able to see these very old photos and histories of our land and ancestors. This makes me very happy." So again, we also see this element of emotions and affect to be quite strong in this encounter. In contrast to the native, the idea of ancestors established relationality with those pictured in the archives, thus transforming them into sites of healing through new imaginations and invoking lost ties. The second theme is that of remembering in relation to the, and that was in relation to the maps in particular, and this was through the concept of Purkhauli Tau, Purkha meaning ancestor, Purkhauli Tau meaning ancestral place, reframing the imagination through subjective maps of belonging. Through this lens, the land is where the ancestral spirits reside and where their mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers were born and who still live on in their communities through oral narratives. Maps therefore were seen through this lens of intimate, emotive and even spiritual sense of belonging. This emerged particularly through the remapping segment of the workshop, where participants physically rearranged the maps, piecing them together based on the logic of ancestral homelands, where rather than separate entities, these different maps, these maps were arranged in a fluid sequence, like piecing puzzle pieces together to create a new map of the region, as you can see here. So you've got like Western Nepal, Central Nepal, Eastern Nepal, the Mount Everest region, Darjeeling and Sikkim, and then Tibet. So all of these sort of were placed in a sequence. So this symbolizes what Oslander calls the act of remembering, or putting together again a different geographical imagination rooted in diasporic indigenous experiences and worldviews. This also reflects Enzoa's statement that while archive is a site of lost origin where memory is dispossessed, it is also a site for hopeful futures where acts of remembering and regeneration can occur. Now, working with these maps also stirred up personal emotions and questions of identity and belonging for myself, which particularly emerged through the map conversation session at the RGS annual conference last year. In the months after the conference, myself and my co-author Iqbal Singh, who is not here today, we used a letter writing exercise guided by the prompt "What came up for us" to unpack our encounters with the maps. For me, as someone from Sikkim, which is now in Northeast India, now living in the UK as in a diasporic context, engaging with these colonial maps was deeply, deeply affective. One map out of the many maps really stood out for me, which is in the picture, that is called Tanner's map of Sikkim, Darjeeling, Eastern Nepal, Tibet and Bhutan. Through an epistolary approach, I came to understand maps as sites of emotional resonance where my own ancestral memory lingers and can be reactivated through affective, embodied and performative engagement. And to this end, I want to quickly read an excerpt from the letter which I wrote back to this map. So this is the bit from the letter. I often dream of coexisting in multiple places, in the Himalaya and the British Isles at the same time. In my dreams, places like Sikkim and London merge, centers and peripheries collapse, boundaries entangle and borders blur. Perhaps the dream stems from my intense engagement with maps while writing this paper, or it reflects my longing for home arising from the deep subconscious of my diasporic mind. Or better yet, as the elders would say, the dream carries a message from my ancestors. Whatever the reason, the dream has provided a critical lens through which to write this letter. I've been closely looking at colonial maps of Eastern Himalaya at the RGS's archives. With no cartographic training, I cannot read the technical dimensions of modern maps, but they evoke a peculiar feeling in me. The maps remind me of my family's stories passed down through generations. As I linger, one map stands out: Colonel Tanner's 1886 sketch map of Sikkim and parts of Darjeeling, Nepal, Tibet, and Bhutan. Fragile, with a permanent tent of sepia, the map symbolizes the power to measure, know, and order the world. The fact that this visual artifact created by a colonial military officer has landed in my hands fills me with a sense of purpose, to undo my cartographically colonized mind and reimagine the world. My gaze settles on the yellow-blue color-coded lines demarcating the territorial boundaries between the British Indian Empire and the Himalayan kingdoms, representing it as a buffer zone. I notice that the right side of the map is partially blank, with unexplored written in bold. Unexplored for whom, I wonder, reflecting on the role of coloniality in the erasure of indigenous identities that weren't discovered by the West like my own. Despite this erasure, this map reminds me of my father's stories about my great-great-grandfather or the grandfather before him, whose name we don't remember, except that he was called Chepte Bijua, or the Flat Shaman, for reasons lost to memory. They say that he was the youngest among 3 brothers who left our ancestral land, also Purkhauli Tau, or Kiput in my own language, in the indigenous Khumbuwan territory of present-day Eastern Nepal and journeyed eastward to Sikkim. There are no modern theories of migration that can explain this journey, perhaps because he was only wayfinding across fluid landscapes before the borders and nation-states were epistemologically imposed on them, labeling my ancestors as immigrants. We remember little about my great-great-grandfather, except that he was a powerful shaman who died on a rainy day on his way to the closest market town, Darjeeling. I try to retrace his imaginative routes on this map, wondering what these borderlines would mean for him, for he was only traversing the landscape, crossing manufactured lines like the birds and red pandas that wander the terrain. Perhaps my great-great-grandfather too dreamt of landscapes without borders, much like I do today. So I want to conclude by referring to Irene Hurd's essay, which reminds us that indigenous mapping often merges the tangible and the spiritual, where dreams guide the cartographic process, revealing what Hurd calls the indigenous depth of place. Similarly, Helen Gilbert's work on indigeneity and performance suggests that indigeneity itself is performative, constructed through embodied acts of storytelling, recaptioning, remapping, dancing, and dreaming. So through this lens, therefore, these maps themselves emerged as a performative mediator or a go-between, probably like my great-grandfather, who was a shaman, which is also a go-between between worlds, that invite dialogue between dominant and marginalized narratives, between community members and academic researchers, between ancestors and their descendants, acting as prompts for conversation and catalyst for action. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to the organizers and all of you who have come today for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you particularly to Katie, very fine map curator and historian. Thanks also to the Sunderland collection, who I have yet to get to know, but is a key sponsor of this event. I feel very lucky today, actually, to be part of this session, to speak alongside Rohihi, both because we're alums of Manchester, and I began my career doing work on maps and translation, so we're very much on the same key, playing in the same key. Today, in this short time, I want to think a little bit about maps in 4 ways. The first is in terms of a geographical imaginary, the way in which we picture the world, through your kind introduction. This is a kind of, it was called the Northwest Pan-Inuit Trails Atlas of remapping the Northwest Passage. So imagination is a key part, I think, of how we live in relation to the rest of the world, and it's certainly closely tied in with cartography. Often we kind of think of maps as fundamentally part of visual culture, but we've already heard today in the previous session and just now that maps are not only visual artifacts. Katie was reminding us they are also AU oral artifacts. So one of my questions for us, because I think it's quite a novel and interesting question, is how do we listen to maps? Question 1. Secondly, coming back to what this map depicts, let me say, these lines are each trails of Inuit, the people of northern Canada and Alaska, Greenland. They're trails that interconnect, and we started this project to try and work out if these trails interconnect. So I collaborated with Claudio Aporta, an anthropologist from Argentina originally, the Geomatics Center at Carleton University in Canada, and also with Inuit that Claudio and I had worked with over decades, without which the project would not have been possible. And our question was a simple one, which is, could you travel from the left side of this map, or this part of the far side of the Inuit world, up to this side of the Inuit world, from one end to the other, in principle? And by mapping these trails, we discovered that they were sufficiently connected. And it's an interactive atlas, so I'm not going to today, but we can click on it and see the intricate details and connections, which shows you how the Inuit world is fully connected and has been for many hundreds of years. and indeed the migrations do go back thousands of years. So the pitch for this project, in a way, particularly because the media were quite interested in it, was let's reimagine the top of North America, how we imagine the North American continent. And instead of thinking of it in ways that one might, often through newspapers and popular literature and travel writing, as this kind of northwest passage across the top of the world, let's think about it instead as this connected series of trails, real trails, crossing through snow and sea ice, permafrost and land, from one part of the Inuit world, Inuit Nuninga, to the other. Okay. That's what this set out to do. And it's really nice to have this opportunity to share a different vision of what the Inuit world brings to North America, what we imagine to be North America. So that's my second point. My third is that maps, of course, are projections. And I'm actually very interested in the history of map projections, and I love the fact that the Sunderland collection prizes early modern maps. It's very important. But what are they projections of? And my answer to that is in many ways, they are projections of stories. Stories is a complicated word. It's kind of easy to undervaluate the notion of story as something that's there to entertain. I mean, story is lived experience, something more profound. So we're looking at a projection of a whole series of many stories that were recorded. All of these trails, in this case, were recorded historically by Inuit for visitors, for geologists, for Royal Navy explorers, for their own lawyers, actually, and for land claims. Quite a lot of this map was created by Inuit for their negotiations with the state of Canada to demonstrate, and this is a really important word in the Indigenous world, occupancy, which is the notion that people have this deep historical ongoing relationship with, they call it land, but it includes sea, air, and so on, that exceeds any kind of simple description or any, that can't be reduced to measurement, for example. Now, you might notice that there aren't many place names on the map. If we were to click on these circles with numbers, the number actually tells you the number of place names in that circle if you magnify the map, which I invite you to go and explore afterwards. So where it's 3, there are 3 place names. There are all names in the Inuit language, and there was a move not so long ago to put all these names back on the kind of the official country maps. Now, since the storied land has been around for several thousand years, and parts of it more recently, maybe like the map collections here, 500, 600, 700, 800 years. Along came some more recent political formations, the main one being in the center here, a country now called Canada, scarcely 150 years old. Another fairly new country to the left, to the United States, around Alaska. And then to the right here, where the trails continue, is Greenland, which was colonized in 1721 by the Kingdom of Denmark. So this atlas, I call this a digital atlas, was created in roughly the period 2010 to 2014. It undergoes renewed visual meanings and ways of interpreting it. Let me show you what I mean. But first, just a clarification. This map is not exhaustive. It doesn't show all the trails. It's got large areas, including the west coast of Greenland and further south that don't show Inuit trails. So it's the idea that's implicit here. Okay. Now, I'm going to take this map. I'm going to be in 2 weeks' time in Nuuk, which is the capital of Greenland, talking at a conference there. I think you'll understand the theme of the conference at the Greenland Science Summit when I tell you that the title of the conference is called All Eyes on Greenland. Yeah. And one of the things this map does that makes me think that I wouldn't have thought a few years ago, or not in the same way, is how close these kind of hidden states of Greenland, Denmark, Canada, and Alaska are. We talked about oversized islands. And like Sri Lanka and other regions, this is also an archipelago. And actually, we discover that Greenland, northern Canada, and Alaska, they're really actually quite close. This isn't a map of a vast area. It's a map of an intricately tied together small area. So at the very least, it ought to get us to think a little bit about the risks of being neighbors. When I go to Greenland, one of the things I will certainly not do is tell them how their country should be mapped. But what I will try to do is make some reference to the stories behind what we think of as maps today. In other words, I will go to listen rather than to tell or to project. Okay? Lastly, then, what I also want to get you to think about or to listen to is the maps that I'm not showing here. I'm not an indigenous Inuk or Inuit. I've worked with Inuit for many decades. But I also think that there are images that I don't necessarily have the right to show today. I would in some circumstances. But today I'm in a different setting, in a setting that's being filmed. So I had to think a little bit about what would the elders who are the source of these stories, some that I have met and known, what would they have me do? So I think this is about right. But I suppose I did want to take the opportunity, Rohihi, is I recognized in a way quite a lot of similarity in the renaming and the reworking of memory in the workshops that we did in some of these northern communities, like in Pond Inlet, which the Inuit called Mitimatilik, up here. So that's the takeaway. I'll stop in just a moment, just to say, please note that there's nothing on this map that says the Northwest Passage. So that's kind of one of the points. And if it's not there, what is there? And the answer is there are these stories. I'll finish with one short story. When I began doing my oral history on cartography with the Inuit about 40 years ago, well into the kind of late 20th century, I asked Noah Piugatuk, who is a really distinguished elder of the Iglulik Inuit, the Iglulingmiut, and now actually features in a wonderful film. He'd started traveling in these lands in the early 1900s. He was an early catechist. He's probably one of the most knowledgeable Inuit of the 20th century. And so I asked him, I said, Inuit are really famous for their use of maps. And it's something cartographers, historians of cartography enjoy and appreciate. I said, but I understood that a lot of this map use came out of the tradition of having to negotiate with the state for the protection of their lands and their occupancy, right? So they've never been divorced from power. But I said to him, when did you start using maps? And he said to me, well, it was when the Canadian state came up here in the early days and I was young. And there was someone who had come up and had got lost. I said, oh, so did you need to draw a map for them? He said, no, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police came looking for the person who was lost, so I had to draw a map to help the police understand where they were and where the person who was lost is, and then to take them with the map to rescue the person who was lost. So that's probably a good place to move to the conversation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both. I think I'm going to start actually from this point of storytelling because it's very different to the previous panel and session. And in particular, how then this interpretive aspect of stories gets to be marked on a piece of paper, or in the context of the atlas, the Inuit Atlas, it's on a digital platform. And where do you see the ethical kind of implications? And I know, Michael, you mentioned, I'm not going to put images up there because they're not for me to own. But with your work, Rohihi, because you are part of that community and your positionality is incredibly important, you felt it's okay for you to share the details and the intimate and affective kind of versions of the stories that came up from looking at maps. So really the question is how and what kind of cartographic logic in terms of conventional cartography must be confronted when we're looking at working with indigenous mapping practices.
Sorry, can you repeat the last bit again, because I was thinking while you were...
yeah, so it's just what sort of cartographic traditions need to be confronted in order for indigenous mapping to become a tool of knowledge making?
I think a very straightforward answer would be both colonial and nationalistic forms of cartography. And this is again my positionality, but also coming from a border state, which is Sikkim, right? And Sikkim, which was a Buddhist monarchy until 1975, it was a British protectorate, so it was never formally colonized, but it was a very strategic buffer zone, which is the official term that the colonial administration used in the context of the Himalayan region, and then later becoming an Indian protectorate for a few years, and then becoming the 22nd state of the Indian Union. So coming from that sort of geopolitical context, I think the two dominant forms of cartographies that indigenous forms of mapping need to confront and work around and negotiate, as you mentioned, negotiating with state is really important, I think would be obviously the colonial cartographic sort of imagination, because that really set the stage for later nationalistic imaginaries as well. So yeah, I could expand on that as I think, but I would say these two dominant forms of maps.
Well, I would agree with that. And I mean, also just connecting a little bit to the last session, because I really appreciated the historical dimension of the last session. That to understand that maps are constantly rubbing up against ideas that are fluid and shifting. So there isn't kind of the fixity of maps. And I think the history of, just to come back, because I'm very invested also in the history of cartography. Don't get the impression that I don't enjoy cartography, quite the reverse. But it has to be handled with care, I suppose. I think the thing that the single thought I brought with me, if there was one today, was trying to find a way not to use an expression like the power of maps, but to mean that these things have to be held very carefully in the way, partly in the way that archivists teach us, but also in the way in which the owners of these lands and knowledge also, their injunction to us. And I suppose the other thing that I would say, therefore, with a serious interest in the history of cartography is I also kind of wish that we took historically more seriously early modern maps. That was part of my delight. Maybe we could come back to that. But I think they tell really important stories for the world that we're looking at in the present day. And sometimes in my own field, particularly the polar world, we're a little bit myopic and look only at the recent colonial history from about 1900 rather than the early modern one, which I think in some ways is more informative.
Can we go back even before the early modern as well? Yes. And I'm just kind of thinking from an indigenous perspective. So I work with maps from the Middle East, but it's also looking back at the indigenous kind of map making as an actual field of practice. And they were really interested, so in Mesopotamian times, that they were interested in redrawing and imagining the world.
Yes.
So there are lots of those maps, and in fact, there is an artifact, there is a piece in the British Museum, which is the map of the world drawn, made by Mesopotamian cartographers, but they didn't know that's what they were doing. So the question is, where do you draw that line in terms of looking back? It's not just the confrontation of colonial history. It's not also pre-modern only. How do we go back as far as that and dig deep into those archives, and whose voice comes forward? Is it the English-speaking voice in the end, because that's the publications and the archive and the documentation in a way?
First of all, I think you make the really important point about decentering maps culturally. And I think that's an unmitigated good move. And one everyone can enjoy. And to understand that maps are made across many different cultures and different traditions of print culture is really central. But with that, and actually the reason that I think kind of the early modern and going further back to the ancients matters so much, and I'm sort of a late convert. I started as a kind of Enlightenment, long 18th century historian. And writing my book about the North Pole, I was forced, actually, to go back and read kind of 16th century history. What going further back did for me was I began to realize that the mapping of the region like this, actually, you couldn't write a book about it without writing about the history of cosmology and astronomy. And a lot of writing about the last 200 years assumes that those are really separate spheres. But by going further back, by seeing how integral the cosmos was to the governing of affairs terrestrially in all these kingdoms, the cosmological vision, I think, in many ways lends itself more easily to a dialogue across cultural traditions.
Yeah, absolutely.
You say?
Yeah, I think the point on cosmological sort of framework is really important, and I was just reflecting on how back, how further can we look back, right? And I'm just thinking in terms of the work that I'm doing with communities, and I've been thinking, I'm not a geographer or cartographer, so I'm really, trying to think around these things and so on and so forth. And I'm working with dance as well, as I mentioned earlier, right? At least in the Himalayan communities context, there was no written there's no written documentation, right? So most of the knowledge that has been passed on is oral and embodied, right? Like for example, one of the main sort of oral text, if you call it, is the Mundum, right, which has multiple interpretations again. So as one of the community members said, it's like touching an elephant in a dark room where you don't know what part you're touching. You're just, sort of understanding from that, body part of the elephant without understanding that there's a whole elephant in the room. So that sort of thing. So I think for me, I would say looking at the oral and the embodied and the emplaced understanding of maps in that sense in terms of indigenous communities. So again, talking about dance, I'm trying to look at how dance can be a form of cartography. One of the main sort of genesis story of dance that I'm looking at currently, which is Sakelasili dance, for instance, is that, a father-in-law, it's gendered as well, a father-in-law and a son-in-law, they go on hunting, they are not successful, but they keep encountering a rock, so they plan to take the rock back home, but the rock falls on the ground and it's emplaced, right? And then they bring the shamans and they start dancing around the rock, and therefore the dance becomes a part of the tradition to honor the rock, which is actually an incarnate of the jungle spirit, right? So interestingly, the rock apparently still exists somewhere in eastern Nepal, and then it becomes a part of that, spiritual geography as well, right? So when the shamans go on trance, which is also seen as dance, they traverse, so you say, okay, I've reached Hangu Lake, I've reached this lake, I've reached this river, I've reached these rocks, so there's that cosmological, spiritual dimension. So I think we need to look into the oral, the embodied, and these are very much emplaced as well, so those dimensions of understanding the geography from an indigenous perspective.
So interesting. I think we'd all probably want to understand dance better, because I think you're also showing us how dance links to stories more profoundly than we might suppose, right? The same would be true with Inuit and drum dancing, which becomes one of the settings for telling stories. But telling stories is also how navigational knowledge is translated. So it's all this on the one hand, these kind of special moments and celebrations in kagiks, these giant igloos and so on. But it's also what you might call mundane, but super important, like, which is how do you get from A to B in a blizzard without dying? How do you recognize the names of places in the landscape as you travel every day, right? And do you see them, if I may ask, do you see them being, could you say a bit more about how those might be connected through dance?
So I'm still exploring that topic, but I feel like dance can be a form of, counter cartography, and also I think in a way it is an archive. It's a cultural archive, right? And especially among communities who don't have oral modes of transmitting knowledge, then dance becomes really important, because then the word repertoire, right? It's a repertoire of knowledge that is, activated through embodied engagement, right? And again, dance is a part of storytelling. The dances have stories in them, and then like how, it becomes like you said, a navigational story as well, right? So I mean, I can go on telling stories about how to, navigate, but I think there is something, about embodiment, performativity, and mapping, which I think I would like to explore in future work.
I would like to pick both your brains actually on this, the creative practice that is embodied within the communities that you worked with, which came across in the maps. So whether it's trails, walks, whether it's dance, it's all forms of storytelling. But how do you find creative practice kind of bringing in more of these new ways of creating maps and knowledge making through maps? In what way you find it liberating or ethically constraining, or how do you navigate that space?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of embodiment and like creativity, from my experience so far, which is pretty limited in terms of working with maps, but I feel like when we create a map through creative, embodied sort of and participatory practice, it doesn't look like a map that we think of, So even when I'm working, I think you can, add to that. But then I'm like, is this actually a map that we're creating, or what is a map, right? Because it doesn't look like a map that we see, like So yeah, I think it then ties to then what is a map.
I bring in 2 points. One is the creative.
Yeah.
First of all, it's ever so important because it gives us a way into understanding trans or intergenerational knowledge. Avoids the mistake where people complain too much about young people because they don't keep up the old traditions, right? And a lot of the creativity you'll find through dance, you might see in the Inuit world through hip hop, through throat singing, actually through a multitude of different artistic practices, which should be taken seriously. And probably they do lend themselves to these kinds of arguments. Yeah. That brings us, in my view, also back to the ethical question, to which I don't pretend actually to have the answers or all the answers, maybe some of them. So when I worked with Inuit filmmakers, video makers from the outset, that's sort of how I got into this. And they were listening. They're very interested in maps, my colleagues, but they were listening to the stories their parents and grandparents who had lived and been brought up on the land would tell them. And they've turned them into films, and some of them quite famous and successful films now. One of the things I learned from working with them, that as kind of, I don't want to describe them as practical businessmen, but in a world in which Indigenous people in the power relationship are constantly on the weaker receiving end, and that needs to be said, kind of almost everywhere and at all times. I mean, in Greenland right now, there are 50,000 Greenlanders. keep that in mind when we read the newspapers. So one of the things, though, my filmmakers were really strict about was it wasn't just that they were creative, and they shared that very generously. Anyone could get involved in making these films. You just had to be there, kind of. It was inclusive, but they were absolutely insistent on the protection of digital content. And I'm talking about the 1980s, because that was the moment in which it moved into Sony Betamax, for those of you who remember your VHS players and so on, right? And the one thing that they knew was that the phone would be ringing off the hook every day from people running arts festivals going, oh, we really love what you do. Do you think, you know, like you could just give us your film for this and for that? And they go like, no. You have to think a lot harder about where these images and where these maps belong and why. Partly financially, they really matter. Like, it's important who controls them. So if you go back to these land claim maps, that had a lot to do with, I mean, the proliferation of Indigenous map making around the world. And Canada was quite exemplary. Indigenous peoples in Canada played an important role. So for them, it was really crucial that they were in charge of the mapping process. They hired geographers, they hired cartographers to do the work for them, because these maps needed to hold up in negotiations with powerful states who would rather not have to do this. They needed to be credible in courts of law as bodies of evidence. So the ethics of who controls the image, and I'm sure people who work with maps will also understand in a slightly different, nuanced way how important that is.
Yeah, I want to add to this dialogue, talking about like creativity, ethics, but also I think, since it's being recorded, I'll keep it very subtle, but also when you're working in, like, let's say, contested territories, border regions, right? As a researcher, going there and saying, oh, I'm going to look at the politics of indigeneity becomes a threat for the state, and you might not get access to that. But again, I at least, you know, in what I've seen in my own practice as well, when we use that creative element, it becomes more palatable as an entry point to be able to then examine these bigger questions around politics and power and so on. And it is also very participatory, because then communities really engage with these practices and processes.
It's interesting. So it's the breaking of the systemic
barriers
and well, colonial kind of presence, isn't it? That keeps coming up. There are several really interesting questions here, and I think I will just start with this one. It says, do non-Indigenous scholars have responsibilities to Indigenous communities and scholars when researching Indigenous topics? What sort of responsibilities these may be?
Well, perhaps I could answer first as the non-Indigenous scholar. But, well, absolutely. Now, it's at the heart of this is some notion of an equitable partnership, and Indigenous peoples in most parts of the world, particularly those that are more politically active, will try to insist that the partnership, in order to be equitable, involves a partnership that begins early on at the time of making the project. So we see in the non-Indigenous world, because of the structure of research councils, because of colonial assumptions and so on, people will come along and say, well, I've got this great project, you know, could you also, like, tell us your traditional knowledge about it? And that's not really the way to start, but I think today it remains still kind of entrenched. Would you say?
Yeah, and I would like to add to that from a perspective of an insider working with the communities. Insiderness is very intersectional, like Sujit mentioned earlier about intersectional identity. So even though I'm from the community, I'm based in a very prestigious university in the global north, I have my class and academic privilege. So I also need to really think about that power relation when going and working with my own communities, for instance. And then there is, you know, those added layer of the internal politics and things which you'll have to navigate, right? But I really agree the fact that I think right from the start, right from the conception, there has to be a co-production of knowledge, and the co-productive element has to be, it has to remain in every, or it has to sort of guide every part of the research process. And also I think the idea of, I don't know, again, as you mentioned, it's contested and it's very blurry, but again, wherever you can, you know, getting consent at every stage of your work with communities.
I find it more, we get to be in the center of this question around the ethics of being researched, coming from an Indigenous background, doing research on Indigenous people, just like you, Rohihi. I think we get to be under the microscope by those communities even more than a non-Indigenous person coming and working.
Yesterday, I was at Cambridge and we had a conference on Himalayan studies and we were talking about dance. And this is where we said, like, especially as insider scholars, you know, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So I think there's that element of having to navigate, okay, what are the community members, elders going to say? Okay, but how do I present it in an academic setting as well? So I think there's
a lot of extra layers of politics, definitely. How are memories, remembering, and ancestral sites being collected and protected today? How are they being protected today? Yeah.
Rohihi?
Okay, so I can talk in the diasporic context, or I can talk in the Himalayan regional context. In the diasporic context, I think these are largely community-led. So the community organizations that I mentioned earlier, they're really at the forefront of these kind of work, and they are really underfunded, undersupported, underserved. So I think that's one. Back home as well, largely it's the community organizations who are working, and as again we talked about state and, you know, having to navigate, it is this constant process of, okay, you know, you can't say, oh, I can't, you know, as community organizations and members, well, I'm going to indigenize and decolonize by not engaging with structures of power. You have to work within the structures of power, be it the state government, the political parties and things like that. And back home, I think political parties, again, really shape how communities have to navigate that as well, if that makes sense. So I think, it's a community organization. And what I've noticed is in the recent years, the younger generation are also really, really coming up as like, you know, key knowledge holders, I would say. So they are the ones who are sort of really behind this resurgence of, you know, cultural practices like dances.
I think what I'd add to that, and particularly because all of you are here, you're here for a reason, you've chosen to be. So you only need to watch the news, really, to see how much Indigenous history and material culture is out there, but also how much is being wiped out all the time. In almost any week, you'll find stories, right? And it's not happening just in countries with kind of rogue non-states. It's happening in the G7 all the time. Maybe some of it's pragmatic, you know, can you preserve or conserve everything? No, you have to make choices. No, but in really real ways, a lot's being lost. So just to kind of put it out there to think together, I would say, well, what if we take a step back and we think today, Sujit talked a little bit about the loss of biodiversity, the many different framings of thinking about cartography. So if we think about the way in which the world is really becoming a monoculture in terms of its crops, in terms of the consumption of popular culture, in terms of, then I think we see symbolically and practically like how much work has to be put into conserving kind of any of these traditions. It's not a winning battle, to be honest, but it's an important one, and I think we really cherish the wins when we see them.
So I've got two questions, one for you, Rohihi, and one for you, Michael, and maybe it's an extension of what you just mentioned, Michael. Do you have plans to extend the atlas to the south? Presumably also Greenland, and how that map change or add to the stories captured?
I have the take-up for this project, I think in the best way, has been from groups both in the Inuit world, but also in the other northern peoples, the Sami, of northern Scandinavia. Sápmi is their territory, and other regions who've seen this. And I think if it's had any influence at all in inspiring or thinking, well, we could do that with our land, then I think that's in a way how I see it being extended, rather than seeking to make it more comprehensive.
And Rohihi, are there examples of contemporary artistic and performative responses in these communities to existing maps?
To existing maps. So I don't know if specifically to maps, but there is a lot in the UK. So because I was talking in relation to diasporic indigeneity, so again, coming to the UK context, there's a huge creative wave around, second generation British Nepali who are from indigenous background, right? And they're doing a lot of work. For example, Sandhya Gurung, who is a dance artist who performed here at the RGS, she's using fusion music along with her traditional dance, which is a form of trance dance, to sort of recreate, indigenous cultural practices. There are dance groups, again, within this community organization, things like that. So that's in the diasporic context, but back home as well. I think, I don't know why I keep going back to the younger generation as well, because they're really sort of, pushing the boundaries. So I can't say specifically in relation to maps, but definitely to archiving and re-archiving. There's a lot of work going around back home as well. For instance, there's a collective called Confluence Collective who are really sort of trying to take in the collate and sort of reinterpret family histories and archives and those kind of bottom-up narratives in the region. There's another project that's looking at similar ways of archiving oral traditions in digital platform and things like that. So not specifically in relation to maps, but I think especially the young generation, as you mentioned, are tech savvy, they're on social media, things like that. So I think there is a lot of that creative potential that's coming up, and we probably will see more of that in the future years.
I agree. I mean, I think you've left me with a lot to think about. I think I'd like to understand after this better the relationship between dance and its allied arts and cartography. I think that's, obviously it's a deep question that you're bringing to us. Yeah. I think requires more.
I myself don't have an answer to.
Because as you were asking about, the creativity is so rich, and honestly, I think for many communities, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, we don't need to look very far to my own community in the east of London. It's not creativity as a thing in its own right, but if we're thinking about the health of our communities and what the energy and the support and the ideas, I'm not saying this very well, but at the heart of healthy communities, seems to me, I hear something in your work, right, about this conjuncture of being creative, but also having the things to be creative with. Yeah. And I think what I want to say is I want cartography, insofar as it's appropriate, to be part of that conversation. Yeah. It's one such tool, would you say?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned earlier on that there is this act of remembering while people were stitching maps, and kind of navigating, but really through the stories that they were. And when I've done something similar, I've had responses from people saying this has been a cathartic kind of experience of doing something like that. What was the outcome from the workshops that you did and the mapping that you did with the community? And I think for you, Michael, what was the Inuit community getting out of a project like yours? Is it just providing maps for sovereignty and border control and so on?
So I think for me, there were multiple layers, I think, to that question. So how communities, the first layer is, yes, they are, they appreciate these spaces because they are invisibilized in most of, let's say, particularly here I'm talking about archival space, but also cultural spaces, right? And especially the communities that I'm working with. So yes, it was a space for them to, assert their presence. But at the same time, I think, you know, in a space like RGS, it is a hegemonic space, right? So coming here for them and engaging with maps, and at first I might be wrong, it's my understanding that there was a sense of intimidation as well, encountering with the map, and only after a while then the community was like, okay, yeah, okay, can we touch this, you know, things like that. Whereas I think an academic would just go and, you know, so those little modes of micro interaction and micro embodied practices and things like that. So one was that. The other thing with the communities was that when they were looking at the maps, and a few of them, especially the elders, are retirees from the Gurkha sort of regiment of the British Army, so they are very adept at reading maps from a military perspective, as opposed to me, who I can't read the technical side of maps. So they were like, oh yeah, but this is missing, you know, or this is not. So they could see the absences in these maps, which I found quite interesting, and how like they were placing the maps and saying, okay, this is like, oh, you know, and they were not necessarily trying to place and stitch things together. They were just like, oh, this is how it makes sense in that respect. And I think like the dancing element again, and the sound, because the dancers had a lot of drumming involved, and we were worried that, you know, the rest of the members in the RGS working would get disturbed and so on. But Catherine and Sarah, everyone was very supportive of that whole workshop. But we were dancing here and we could hear the sounds of the drum in the archives, and that for me and other community members also mentioned that that drumming sound that reaching the archive was like invoking the ancestors as well in many ways, so that, you know, there was that sensory and that, you know, affective again aspect of these performative, creative practices, and how we can interpret it in so many ways. But yeah, there is, again, at the end of the day, there is a power relation in terms of, again, accessing and, you know, encountering and so on and so forth. But my experience was that, yeah.
There was a moment that was really important for my understanding of this, because the workshop that we did in Pond Inlet involved an elder society. So we had these large floor maps that would occupy some of the seating area here. Instead of having a map on a table, everyone was in socks and protective equipment on the maps, on the floor maps. And the elders were talking to each other and drawing trails on these giant Google maps. And it was a very sociable event. Now, my understanding changed after doing that. I stopped thinking about map makers in the kind of early modern tradition of the artisan, which is usually the individual person, right? Even if that's not quite accurate, because early modern maps were made by, goodness knows, many groups of different skilled people. But this supposition that we have, or I had anyway, which is that, you know, you've got this person who draws the map. That's how maps get made. Turns out that's not how maps get made at all. And this came to me when I was fortunate to write a piece, I think in the title, Suggestive Cartographic Gestures, and actually Joe Smith, the director, was thanks to your invitation to write that very short piece, that I came to understand that the kind of mythography, we've been talking around a little bit, this idea of accuracy. The idea of accuracy is tied to this notion of the piece of paper and the indigenous cartographer who just magically is able to draw the lines in exactly the right places. It's not that at all. I realized working with this group of elders, what they were doing, mostly they were talking to each other. They happened by invitation and agreement, their consent, and to be on these huge, you know, Google corporation maps. But what they were doing when they were drawing the trails through the mountains and in the valleys, they were talking to each other about the camps that they used to visit, the times that they had together when they were young together, the things that happened, the skills. They'd occasionally stop and explain to me, yeah, this is a giant trail here. That's why we've got so many lines. This is one of our super highways. But mostly it was the conversation. So I realized that drawing maps actually begins as a social activity. And what I saw there was actually really close to what you're describing as dance, I suppose. Yeah. And that actually the delineation on the paper is not the story at all. Yeah. But we I think, I had up until then, we mistake it for the performance.
Yeah. I have a question for you. You know, in your work with communities and doing the workshop and things like that, was walking, the act of walking, like did it come up as a theme in your contour mapping practices? But I'm just thinking, when you were saying these stories, I'm kind of thinking about like my father's stories about, you know, the places. And first, now I'm thinking when you're saying this, like they just know the place, right? So like they're like, oh yeah, you go this way. And I was showing some of these archival pictures to my dad, and he just knew where it was. And I was just stunned, like how, you know, and I think it's because of those stories and those, you know, lived experiences in those places as well. And a lot of the time it's about walking. And I can't imagine walking that much now, because there are stories about, okay, we walk from this hill to the other hill on the other side in a day, right? And like, you know, so there's those stories and those, I mean, I can't imagine walking that much. So like, you know, the act of walking and then remembering places. And interestingly, my father also told me stories about how, like, in the, again, Himalayan context, like there is this idea that every turn, because hilly places you have turns, every turn has a place deity, right? So back in the days, now you don't do it so much, but every day, every time you take a turn, you take permission from the deity of the place. To sort of, you know, navigate that place, right? And now what's happening, which might again, you know, tie to the discussion around environmentalism and things like that. There are a lot of hydroelectric dams being built in the mountains, right? And the state sort of recompensates through large amounts of money, which is very significant for the communities in the region. So they do take the offer. But before sort of laying the foundation of the hydroelectric dams, they again pray to the deity of that specific place to allow for them to construct this dam and so on. So again, like, you know, stories, places, cosmology, things like that. I mean, I don't know if you encountered walking and talking as a...
Look, I'm reminded also of the work of a filmmaker, Britt Kramvig, who's a professor of Sami studies in northern Norway. Whenever we would walk, she would point out rocks and deities and this hidden landscape. I would see rocks and she would see this spirited, storied landscape. I also feel, not overdoing it, but honestly, I think we're very privileged that you're sharing with us today, telling us, I hear you telling us oral history. And I can feel it emerging as in the conversation. I can hear, is it your grandfather, your father?
My father.
Your father's walks and steps, and maybe it helps me to think of, you know, we did a lot of walking, hunting, making those films. It was pretty exhausting, especially, I remember carrying a caribou carcass on my back and sleeping for many, many hours after that. So, what I would say, I mean, I told, you know, kind of not in jest, but when I'd asked Noah Piugatuk about the first time he used paper maps for the police to find a lost person. I mean, there's sort of a quip or a joke in that. But I think behind that, actually you see that the telling, experienced travelers telling often younger travelers or less experienced travelers how to find a place, where to travel. There's actually a deeply indigenous tradition. And that's where, particularly intergenerationally, right, is where I saw it most. And there are lots of examples, you know, because maybe it reflected my own youth. I was quite interested in what people in different parts of the world do when they get lost. Turns out that that's something like a universal, but the way people deal with it's quite different. And one of my mentors told me last year when I went to visit her in Canada, she didn't remember me, and then she did. She said, "Oh yes, you were quite lost." And after I got over the initial chagrin, I thought, "Oh my God, you do remember me." And so there's also like this real context, right, for the stories about walking places and place names, right, is what to do when you are not sure where you are, when you want to get somewhere securely. And also, like, what happens, because people genuinely do get lost, right? Yeah.
Thank you both very much. And please do join me. So thank you.